The Appian Way was one of the first great Roman roads, running 400 miles across the southern half of Italy and linking Rome with the port of Brundisium. If you were one of the thousands of people to walk this road in 73 BC, you might have seen a truly horrific sight. Some 6,000 people suspended from crosses lining either side of the road. The very public fate of these poor souls was a warning, a kind of gruesome billboard. The dead and dying were rebellious slaves from the Spartacus uprising, and as traitors, the Roman state had elected to punish them with their single harshest method of execution, crucifixion. This, the message ran, was the fate of all who would dare to defy Roman power. The din of misery from the thousands of crucified could probably have been heard for miles on end, but the grisly spectacle would not end when they fell silent. The bodies were left posted on the crosses until they fully decomposed or were entirely consumed by wildlife. For months afterward, one of Rome's main economic arteries was a literal highway of death. A free Roman citizen might have felt this a just comeuppance for the rebellious slaves who had plunged the heartland of Italy into chaos and disturbed what they viewed as the proper balance of society. The 30% of inhabitants of Italy who were enslaved, however, would probably shiver at this display of brutality, and the intended message would not have been lost. Step out of line, and this is your fate. It was evidently taken to heart, as there was never another slave uprising anywhere near the scale of Spartacus's rebellion. Rome had achieved peace through superior brutality. The Romans may have perfected crucifixion, but they didn't invent it. The practice came to them through the Greeks. Alexander the Great was a noted fan, but its origin seemed to run back to the Assyrian Empire of the Bronze Age, meaning the cross predated Rome itself by 2,000 years. Despite the antiquity of the practice, modern people tend to associate it with Rome more than any other state because of how eagerly the Romans embraced the practice, plus the sheer number of individuals the Romans crucified for a wide range of offenses. There's a temptation among apologists for Rome's imperial ambitions to paint crucifixion as a bit of nastiness that accompanied Rome's generally positive project of civilization and progress. This reading is at odds with the historical reality that crucifixion was not an unpleasant side effect of Rome's dominance. The terror it inspired was the definitive representation of Roman civilization to the millions of people who lived in the shadow of the cross. The Romans themselves were fully aware of the cultural power of crucifixion. When a young Julius Caesar was kidnapped and ransomed by pirates, he told them that he would live to see them crucified. It's said that the pirates laughed at the audacity of this foolish and ambitious young man they'd managed to capture. But Caesar wasn't kidding. He did indeed live to see all of the pirates killed, but they were not crucified. After having spent so much time among the pirates, they'd become too human in Caesar's eyes, and he couldn't stomach the thought of them suspended from crosses for days on end, with insects and birds picking away at their bodies. He opted for the relatively more humane execution by slit throat. Caesar's decision makes it clear that Romans knew crucifixion really was that bad, and Caesar was an experienced military man, no stranger to death, and certainly not a squeamish personality. Rome's true pampered elite, like Cicero, did their best to not even think about crucifixion.
Let the very word cross be far removed from not only the bodies of Roman citizens, but even from their thoughts, their eyes, and their ears.
Cicero's queasiness is representative of a notable pattern in Roman literature, a marked avoidance of the topic of crucifixion. It's likely the practice was seen as too grotesque by the standards of the educated aristocrats who composed much of the surviving Roman literature. But bear in mind, even these relatively genteel Romans would have still likely attended gladiator fights and dangerous chariot races. That crucifixion was still beyond consideration for them speaks volumes. One exception to the pattern of silence is a brief passage from Seneca the Younger describing the physical impact of crucifixion on a condemned individual, as well as the ways that Roman soldiers amused themselves by crucifying victims in a range of uncomfortable positions. But our best sources come from non-Romans like Josephus and the authors of the Gospels. These conquered populations were the primary targets of crucifixion. For the condemned, crucifixion must have been an agony, but the practice was never just about execution. After all, there are much quicker ways to kill a person than nailing them to a cross. Crucifixion was first and foremost a weapon of psychological warfare and a tool of propaganda. It was a means of enforcing the domination of Rome's ruling class and their ideology. It broadcast the impunity of the Romans while reminding the subjected of their second-class status and perpetual vulnerability. In fact, Roman citizens were legally protected from crucifixion until the 2nd century AD, however terrible their crimes might have been. The practice of crucifixion was most widespread in Roman-controlled territories between the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD, a period which notably includes the life of Jesus of Nazareth. In this era, Romans were in the process of progressively expanding judicial rights for their own citizens, but at the same time, they were massively curtailing these same principles in occupied territories. Crucifixion was a product of this division, intended to pacify restive local populations through terror. Though Roman sources often refer to crucifixion as a punishment fit only for the lowest of the low, the Romans also embraced, like almost all ancient civilizations, the idea of collective punishment, and they didn't always bother to establish the individual guilt of those who would be crucified. Indiscriminate execution of family, associates, bystanders, and even the merely unlucky happened with some regularity. Josephus's chronicles of the Jewish wars depict Romans crucifying anyone who happened to live in a rebellious province, a striking confession for a pro-Roman historian who had fought alongside Titus and whose account was written specifically to defend Roman conduct in Judea. The widespread application of crucifixion was as central to its effectiveness as the extreme pain it induced. It was an instrument of terror, designed to cow a population into submission, because for all they knew, even if they never picked up a weapon, they could be the next to die in agonizing fashion if anyone else did. That's a broad overview of the social and political context of crucifixion, but we would be remiss if we didn't describe the actual process itself. Be warned that what follows is a graphic recounting of the Roman process of crucifixion. Crucifixion ended on a cross, but it didn't begin there. First, on the morning of the execution, the condemned individual would be stripped naked and scourged, whipped across the back and chest with a multi-ended leather whip resembling a cat o' nine tails. Depending on the force used by the executioner, scourging could remove significant amounts of flesh and sometimes killed the condemned before they made it to a cross. Next, the condemned was driven naked through the city and forced to carry the heavy transverse beam of their cross to the place of execution, all while being whipped and pelted with stones from the crowd. The entire ritual was carried out in the city proper to ensure that as many people as possible saw the dehumanized victim to maximize humiliation. They were led to a prominent public location. In Rome, it was right outside the Esquiline Gate, where officials placed signs denoting the individual and their specific crime. Finally, they were attached to the cross by nails or rope. There remains scholarly debate about how often nails were used in crucifixion, as iron was expensive, and few extant remains of crucifixion nails have been unearthed by archaeologists. Most evidence, however, suggests that nails were used more often than not, one nail through the overlapping feet, and a nail through each wrist between the bones of the forearm, the radius and ulna. Contrary to common depiction, a crucified person would not have typically had nails through the palms of the hands, as the tissue and bones of the hands are too weak to support the weight of an adult and would have torn. It is possible, however, that nails through the palm could have been combined with rope around the wrist, and some evidence supports the idea that this practice was used sometimes. None of this could have been accomplished easily or quickly. Driving a nail through flesh and bone would have taken repeated swings of the hammer. The process would have been slow, clumsy, and intimately agonizing. The relative absence of nails leads scholars to believe that they were reused time and again, though some may have disappeared from the archaeological record as Romans viewed crucifixion nails as powerful healing charms. Legionaries would sometimes keep nails for themselves or sell them to merchants so they could be ground into powder for use in ceremonies. The eager consumption of these relics of death by Rome's civilian population drives home just how generally accepted the practice was, even if it was considered unsuitable dinner conversation. With the victim affixed to the cross, crucifixion entered its final stage when the condemned would be left to die slowly over a period of several days. The physical pain during this process would have been intense, as the entire weight of the exhausted individual pulled on the nails or ropes that bound them to the cross, causing excruciating pain in the arms, legs, and torso. Not only were they subjected to the elements, like the sun, rain, and wind, each individual breath was in agony. To allow a full inhalation, victims had to raise themselves up against the beam of the cross, increasing pressure against their ropes or nails, and scraping the bare flesh of their flayed back against the coarse wood of the cross. By the time thirst and hunger set in, the victim had doubtlessly long been wishing for death, but that could still be days away. The process pushed the human body to the brink, meaning that the causes of death among crucifixion victims could vary widely. Blood loss from the scourging was a common killer and may have been the ultimate cause of Jesus' death, as he died after only several hours on the cross. Some died by asphyxiation due to the difficulty of inhaling while suspended, and others perished due to the buildup of carbon dioxide in the blood from an inability to properly exhale. The unimaginable stress that this process placed on the body was such that it could, and at least once did, prove fatal even to a person who'd been taken down from the cross alive. Josephus writes that he was once able to convince the emperor Titus to free 3 men who had been crucified, but 2 of them eventually died from their wounds despite being cared for by the best doctors available.
And when I was sent by Titus Caesar with Syrian and 1,000 horsemen to a certain village called Thecoa, in order to know whether it were a place fit for camp. As I came back, I saw many captives crucified, and remembered 3 of them as my former acquaintance. I was very sorry at this in my mind, and went with tears in my eyes to Titus, and told him of them. So he immediately commanded them to be taken down, and to have the greatest care taken of them, in order to their recovery. Yet 2 of them died under the physician's hands, while the 3rd recovered.
Crucifixion was designed to last for as long as possible, but if the Romans wanted to grant a degree of mercy, or maybe just had to leave the area, they would break the legs of the crucified person, making it impossible to breathe and resulting in a much faster death. It was when the soldiers came to break Jesus' legs that they saw he was already dead. Because of how public the process was, the Romans were well aware of the horrifying reality of crucifixion. But despite the disdain of aristocrats like Cicero, there was never a social movement to abolish the practice. For a Roman, pragmatism and morality were not separate concepts that weighed against each other. They were often viewed as the same thing. Romans felt that crucifixion was indispensable because of its effectiveness as a tool for social control that served the interests of the ruling class. In fact, when the provision preventing Roman citizens from facing crucifixion was eventually repealed in the 2nd century AD, the law was specifically amended to only allow the crucifixion of poor Romans. The Roman legal code of the era separated everyone into 2 social orders, the honestores and the humiliores. The honestores included the economic and political elite, who could be executed only by a mercifully quick decapitation, no matter how heinous their crime, while the humiliores, basically everyone else, were now liable to crucifixion. But even as the number of people eligible for crucifixion increased, absolute numbers of crucifixions began to decline around this time, as the Romans had come to prefer sending all but the very worst criminals to the arena for execution by gladiators or wild beasts. Crucifixion was certainly a horrific way to go, but its entertainment value was low. Romans of this era demanded ever-increasing spectacle to accompany capital punishment. Crucifixion would ultimately be stamped out entirely by the first Christian emperor, Constantine, who banned the practice throughout the empire, replacing it with hanging by the neck. It's no surprise that the first Christian emperor would be the one to end the practice of crucifixion, as it had long been condemned by the Church. In the end, the memory of one victim of crucifixion changed the moral arc of an entire empire.
Hi, Gaius here. Thanks for being part of our efforts to shed light on the more obscure topics related to the fascinating world of the ancient Romans. If you enjoyed Titus's work here, please do us a favor by liking and subscribing. Gratias vobis ago.